Some crimes don't start with screams, they start with a smell. A slow, creeping stench that rises through the floorboards, clings to the curtains, and settles into the lungs of everyone nearby. A smell you try to ignore because it's easier to blame it on the garbage or the heat or the neighbor's cooking than to imagine something worse. But there's always a point where the lie cracks, where the air itself becomes so heavy with rot that it can no longer be dismissed. And when that moment finally comes, when the truth breaks through, it's usually too late. That's how it began in a quiet neighborhood on Imperial Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. With a smell. Not once, not twice, but over and over, neighbors called the city, the police, the landlord. Complaints were filed. Health inspectors came and left. Some believed it was a meat processing plant nearby. Others blamed a broken sewer line. But the truth was much closer, and far worse. Inside the crumbling home at 12,205 Imperial Avenue, Anthony Sowell was keeping the bodies of 11 women, some buried in shallow graves in his basement, others stuffed into crawl spaces or left rotting on the floor, decomposing under blankets, blackened with time and heat and decay. And he lived among them, slept beside them, invited new women in while the remains of his victims surrounded him like trophies of forgotten lives. Sowell, a registered sex offender and ex-Marine, had served time for rape in the 1990s. When he got out, no one was watching. No parole checkups, no house visits. He lived quietly, alone. He offered alcohol and drugs to women who were already struggling. Many of his victims were poor, addicted, or on the margins, and that's what he counted on, that no one would come looking, that no one would care. And for years, he was right. The women disappeared slowly, one in 2007, another in 2008, several more in 2009. Families reported them missing, flyers were hung. But because they were sex workers, addicts, or transient, the cases were deprioritized. The city kept moving, and Sowell kept killing. He lured them into his home with promises of a warm place to sleep or a few dollars. Then he strangled them, usually with his bare hands. In some cases, he raped them while they died. Some victims were left for weeks, others were hidden almost immediately. His home, infested with maggots, soaked in body fluids, rank with rot, became a mausoleum. But still, the complaints about the smell went unanswered, until one day in October 2009, when a woman escaped. Her name was Latundra Billups. She had known Sowell casually, had been to his home before. But this time, he turned violent. He hit her, raped her, tried to strangle her. She fought back. She made it out. She ran to police. And for the first time in years, someone listened. Officers went to Sowell's home to arrest him for assault. He wasn't there, so they entered. What they found stopped them cold. In the living room, a body lay beneath a pile of clothes. In the basement, 2 more. In the backyard, shallow graves. The house wasn't a crime scene, it was a burial ground. One by one, 11 bodies were pulled from the home. Each one bore signs of strangulation. Some had been dead for months, others for years. All had been women from the surrounding area, many of whom had been reported missing but never seriously investigated. Their names were Tonya Carmichael, Tishana Culver, Crystal Dozier, Imelda Hunter, Michelle Mason, Nancy Cobbs, Kim Smith, Janice Webb, Diane Turner, Talacia Fortson, and LaShonda Long. 11 women, 11 lives, 11 opportunities to stop him. And the city had failed each one. Sowell was arrested 2 days later, walking the streets like nothing had happened. During his trial, he sat expressionless as families of the victims spoke through tears. He never apologized, never explained. He simply watched. In 2011, he was convicted of 82 counts of murder, kidnapping, and rape. He was sentenced to death, but he never faced execution. In 2021, Anthony Sowell died of terminal illness while on death row. There was no closure, just more silence. The house on Imperial Avenue was demolished. But the damage can't be erased, not from the families, not from the neighborhood, not from the city that let a killer operate in plain sight while the evidence filled the air for years. Sowell didn't hide his crimes. He simply picked victims the world had already stopped seeing, and that's why he got away with it. The deeper investigators dug into Anthony Sowell's past, the more disturbing the pattern became, not just of the crimes themselves, but of how many times they could have been stopped and weren't. This wasn't a predator who stayed hidden. This was a man who had already served 15 years for rape, been registered as a sex offender, and yet still managed to kill 11 women over the course of several years, while under the supposed watch of state supervision. Sowell's crimes didn't go undetected because he was invisible. They went undetected because the women he targeted were. Each one had a name, a face, a family who loved them. But because they were struggling, because some had prior arrests, addictions, or unstable housing, law enforcement let their disappearances fall through the cracks. Tonya Carmichael's daughter filed a missing persons report in 2008. She pushed, she pleaded. She returned to the police station over and over again. But her mother wasn't listed as high priority. It wasn't until over a year later that her remains were pulled from the backyard of 12,205 Imperial Avenue. Her name had been on a report. Her photo had been posted. She had vanished just minutes from Sowell's door. Yet nothing was done. And she wasn't the only one. Crystal Dozier had vanished years earlier. Her family begged for attention. Michelle Mason had a history of addiction, but was trying to rebuild her life. Kim Smith had been in and out of shelters. All of them fell into the same blind spot, a place where urgency disappears and bodies begin to pile up without anyone asking why. Even after multiple women escaped Sowell's home and went to the police to report being raped or attacked, their stories were dismissed. One woman, Gladys Wade, reported him in 2008, saying he had tried to kill her. She was bruised, bleeding, terrified. Police said there wasn't enough evidence. A rape kit wasn't tested until much later. If that report had been taken seriously, it might have saved half the women who died. But it wasn't. Because she, like the others, was not considered credible. And that's the reality Sowell exploited. He didn't need to hide in the woods or dump bodies in rivers. He simply invited death into his home and relied on silence to keep him safe. His victims' screams were smothered not just by his hands, but by bureaucracy, prejudice, and fatigue. When Latundra Billups finally broke through in October 2009, she did so by surviving long enough to be believed. Her injuries were visible, her story detailed. And perhaps, finally, the pressure from families and neighbors who had been complaining for months became too loud to ignore. But it's what happened during the raid that still haunts the officers who walked into that house. The smell hit them before they opened the door. Flies swarmed the windows. Bloodstains marked the floors. In the basement, wrapped in plastic, lay 2 bodies, stacked like garbage. In the crawl space, partial remains of another. In the 3rd floor, a mattress soaked with human fluids, maggots in the carpet, rats nesting in the corners. 11 women, each killed in the same house, each left to rot, while Sowell continued to lure others in with alcohol, crack, or the promise of shelter. And he did it all while neighbors filed over 30 complaints about the smell. Inspectors came, letters were written, officials blamed the nearby sausage factory. The factory was inspected and cleared. Still, no one investigated Sowell's house. At any point during that 2-year span, a warrant, a single officer stepping through that door, would have uncovered the truth. But it didn't happen, because the victims were not the kind of people cities prioritize. And Sowell knew that. In the trial, the most damning evidence wasn't forensic, it was procedural. How many reports were filed and ignored? How many mothers came in with photographs and were told, she probably left town? The media eventually caught on after the bodies were found. Reporters descended on Imperial Avenue. Cameras filmed the demolition of the house. Interviews were aired with grieving families who spoke with both rage and exhaustion. They weren't just mourning their daughters. They were mourning the trust they'd lost in a city that had abandoned them. Prosecutors detailed how Soul used drugs as bait, how he strangled his victims with cords, belts, even his hands, how he lived among the bodies, eating food, sleeping soundly, inviting others over. And yet, despite the gruesomeness, what stuck most was the simplicity. There was no elaborate scheme, no master plan, just a man, a house, and a system that didn't care enough to stop him. He was convicted of murder, rape, and abuse of a corpse. The jury took less than a day to return the death sentence. But many of the victims' families said it didn't feel like justice. It felt like bureaucracy catching up too late. Soul remained on death row for 10 years. Then, in February 2021, he died of a terminal illness at age 61, still in custody, never executed. Some families said they felt cheated again. Others said they were glad he was gone, no matter how. Either way, he died on his own terms, in a prison bed, not far from the same cold silence that had let him kill in the first place. The house at 12,205 Imperial Avenue is gone now. A memorial sits in its place, a plaque with the victims' names, a few artificial flowers, a rusting chain around the lot. But for those who lived there, for the neighbors who walked past it every day, for the mothers who waited by the phone, it's not enough. Because this wasn't just about a killer. It was about indifference. Soul's crimes were enabled by a system that didn't just miss clues. It refused to look. He was the symptom. The silence was the disease. The silence that protected Anthony Soul wasn't unique. It wasn't even rare. Across the country, in cities big and small, killers have learned the same lesson. If your victims live on the edge of society, no one will come looking. But some go further than silence. Some don't just kill, they record, they document, they keep score like it's a ritual. That's where the next case takes us, deep into the twisted, windowless world of Robert Berdella, a man who didn't just murder, but cataloged pain like it was art. If Soul lived among bodies, Berdella lived among trophies. He was known as the Kansas City Butcher, and what police found inside his home in 1988 still echoes through law enforcement training rooms as a textbook example of depravity hidden beneath normality. Berdella wasn't a drifter or outsider. He was an established member of the community. He ran a booth at the local flea market, sold antiques, and was known by neighbors as quirky but friendly. He had studied culinary arts. He donated to animal rescues. But behind the closed doors of his modest two-story home in Kansas City, Missouri, Berdella was conducting experiments in domination. Between 1984 and 1987, he lured young men, often hitchhikers, addicts, or sex workers, into his home, usually under the pretense of offering food, shelter, or work. Once inside, he drugged them with tranquilizers or crushed prescription pills slipped into drinks. And then, over the course of hours or even days, he would torture them, methodically, clinically, while documenting everything in a series of handwritten logs and Polaroid photographs. The logs were meticulous. He noted the time of each injection, each scream, each act of violation. He referred to his victims by initials. He described how long they lasted before unconsciousness, how many times he shocked them with electrodes, when he broke their bones, when he inserted foreign objects. The photos were worse. Graphic images of men bound, gagged, eyes rolled back in pain, some unconscious, others awake and pleading. Berdella treated their suffering like data, a timeline of torment. One man, Todd Stoops, was held captive for over 6 weeks. Berdella wrote about how he wanted to train him into obedience. He fed him only when necessary. He injected his throat to damage his vocal cords. He wanted silence. Eventually, he killed him, not in rage, but as an inevitability, a logical next step. Another man, Robert Sheldon, was murdered because Berdella found him too noisy to keep. His body was later dismembered with a bone saw, wrapped in trash bags, and left out with the weekly garbage. That was Berdella's disposal method, piece by piece. He never buried. He didn't even leave town. He simply packed body parts into bags, left them at the curb, and let the city sanitation department do the rest. He got away with this for years, because no one looked. The victims, like souls, were men from the margins, estranged from families, distrustful of police, often missing from society's radar. It wasn't until April 2nd, 1988, that it finally unraveled. A young man named Christopher Bryson escaped. He had been held captive for 4 days, repeatedly assaulted and photographed. But when Berdella left the room, Bryson managed to wiggle free of his restraints, leap from a second-story window, and run, still naked, bleeding, and with a broken foot, to a nearby house. He begged for help. The police were called, and when they entered Berdella's home, they walked into something that resembled a serial killer's laboratory. There were syringes on the nightstand. A television in the bedroom played soft music. Ropes dangled from the ceiling, drawers were filled with photos, and in the basement, more bags, more tools, more evidence than anyone expected. They found a human skull, a bone saw, fragments of flesh in the freezer. He hadn't cleaned, he hadn't tried to hide, because up to that moment, he hadn't needed to. He had believed no one would ever escape, and for a long time, he was right. Berdella was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, sodomy, and torture. In his confession, he admitted to killing 6 men. Their names: Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, Todd Stoops, and Larry Pearson. Each had died under different circumstances, but all were tortured first. He described their final moments not with horror, but with clarity, as if recounting recipes. No remorse, no emotion, just the facts. When asked why he kept the logs, he said, "I wanted a record. For myself. That was it." A man who murdered for control, not chaos. Who treated his victims as lab rats and filed their pain away like business receipts. He pled guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life without parole. In 1992, just 4 years. Into his sentence, he died of a heart attack in prison. No warning, no last words, just gone. The families of the victims never got closure. Most of them learned of their sons' deaths through news broadcasts or trial coverage. Few received bodies to bury, only fragments. The photographs, hundreds of them, were deemed too disturbing to release publicly. Even hardened detectives reportedly cried during evidence review sessions. One said, "This wasn't just murder, it was the study of agony." The house was eventually demolished, replaced with a new building. But those who lived nearby never forgot the smell, the silence, the sickening realization that they had walked past a chamber of horror every day for years. Berdella remains one of the most methodical serial killers in American history. And the most disturbing part? He had no clear psychological break. No trauma defense, no insanity plea. He wasn't out of control. He was in total control. That's what makes him unforgettable, because he proves that evil doesn't always rage. Sometimes it plans, it waits, it takes notes, and it smiles while it does it. What haunted detectives most in the aftermath of Robert Berdella's arrest wasn't just what he did. It was how long he did it without being caught. The sheer volume of documentation he left behind proved that this was not impulsive violence. This was a system, an archive. Each victim had a file, a timeline, a visual record of their final hours. Police recovered over 200 Polaroids, most of them too graphic to release publicly. Each one a moment of agony, a frozen second of someone else's nightmare. In the photos, the men are bound with ropes and wires, mouths gagged, eyes swollen. Some are conscious, some are clearly not. In some images, Berdella himself appears in the background, holding a tool or posing with a hand resting on a shoulder like a man posing beside a statue he carved. It was dehumanization taken to its most literal extreme. He had turned people into objects. The logs were worse. Handwritten on legal pads, they chronicled everything, from the first injection of sedatives to the last breath. Berdella tracked how the victims responded to pain, when they stopped screaming, when they passed out, when they soiled themselves, when they bled. He recorded when he fed them and when he withheld food. The notes were clinical, precise, like a surgeon's report. In one case, he described wiring electrodes to a victim's genitals and shocking them at timed intervals. He noted how long the man screamed before losing consciousness. Then he wrote simply, "Reapplied current." No vocal response. That was how he described death. No poetry, just a lack of noise. These logs were not fantasies. They were reports, written by a man who wasn't insane, but deeply methodical. During his interrogation, Berdella showed no emotion. He didn't laugh. He didn't cry. He answered questions clearly, explained how he bought tranquilizers, how he selected victims, how he built his devices. He referred to what he did as behavioral exploration. He said he never intended to kill, only to control. But when things got out of hand, as he put it, he adapted. He didn't panic. He dismembered, bagged the parts, set them out with the trash. That's what disturbed prosecutors most. Not just the murders, but the cleanup. The way he wrapped the pieces with care, bleached the floors, and went back to work at the flea market the next day. How many other killers had thrown their victims away with such ease? And how many of their neighbors had smiled at them in line at the post office? Kansas City wasn't prepared for what the Berdella case revealed. It wasn't just the torture or the dismemberment. It was the fact that this man lived quietly in a populated neighborhood, ran a small business, paid his taxes, and killed 6 people in his home over 4 years, without a single person raising an alarm. The house was 2 stories, brick, with a red front door. Children rode bikes past it. Delivery drivers came and went. No one noticed the smell. No one questioned the large black trash bags stacked at the curb. Even when neighbors heard screams, on more than one occasion, they assumed it was the television or rowdy guests. That's how fragile the boundary is between peace and horror. One wall, one window, one assumption. The trial never went to a full jury. Berdella took a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, agreeing to confess in exchange for life in prison. Prosecutors accepted it, not because they feared losing, but because they wanted to know everything. They wanted him to talk, and he did. Over several days of taped interviews, Berdella described the killings in excruciating detail. He showed investigators the places in the house where each man had been tortured, where he had restrained them, fed them, killed them. He spoke about the murders like a scientist describing failed experiments. And perhaps in his mind, that's exactly what they were. But for the families, the confession was both a relief and a new trauma. Most had spent years not knowing where their sons were. Some had even begun to believe they'd run away. Others still clung to hope that they'd turn up, broken maybe, but alive. The confirmation that their children had died in agony, documented in photos and journals, was almost too much to bear. One father, after viewing a redacted portion of the evidence, said, "I'd rather have never known, because now I can't unsee it." That sentiment was echoed by many. Some refused to claim the remains. Others wanted the house burned down. And eventually, it was. In 1993, the Berdella house was demolished by the city, replaced with a community garden. But the soil still remembers. People still cross the street when passing the lot. And the officers who processed the scene, who saw the photos, read the logs, smelled the rot, say it remains the worst case of their careers. What makes Berdella's legacy so disturbing isn't just what he did, it's how avoidable it seemed. His victims were not untraceable. They had families. Some were last seen entering Berdella's home. There were clues. There were cries for help. But once again, because the victims were poor, gay, transient, or addicted, their disappearances were treated as low priority. The same story, over and over. If not for Christopher Bryson's escape, Berdella might have continued for years. He had no plans to stop. He admitted that. He already had new tools, new drugs. He had learned how to keep victims alive longer. He wanted to refine his methods. He saw it as evolution. That's why he's remembered not just as a killer, but as a technician of suffering, a man who turned torture into routine, who measured agony like it was data, and who trusted, correctly, that the silence around him would hold. Until one man broke it, until one window opened, and the screams finally made it outside. There's something especially chilling about killers who don't need to isolate themselves to hide their crimes. Robert Berdella created a fortress of silence within four walls, counting on societal neglect to do the rest. But Bruce McArthur didn't hide behind curtains or basements. He operated right in the open, on porches, at barbecues, inside churches, surrounded by friends and clients who called him reliable, polite, and warm. He was the kind of man who helped you carry groceries, who trimmed your hedges, who showed up on time and stayed to chat. But he was also quietly stacking up bodies, one by one, and burying them inside garden planters like compost. What made Bruce McArthur terrifying wasn't the brutality, it was the normalcy. Based in Toronto, Canada, but with multiple visits and clientele across northern U.S. states, McArthur targeted vulnerable men in the city's LGBTQ+ community between 2010 and 2017. His victims were often immigrants, people of color, or those struggling with unstable housing and estranged families. Like Berdella, he understood that society has a hierarchy of who gets missed, and he exploited it fully. But unlike Berdella, McArthur didn't lure his victims with promises of shelter. He used dating apps, he used conversation, he smiled, he made people feel safe. Many of his victims were last seen willingly entering his home. There were no screams, no forced entries, just vanished men and no witnesses. The Toronto police initially resisted connecting the disappearances. Between 2010 and 2015, several men, Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdulbasir Faizi, and Majid Kaihan, disappeared from the same neighborhood. All three were part of Toronto's gay village. All three had ties to immigrant or refugee communities. All three were last seen near Church and Wellesley. But no bodies, no forensic evidence. The cases were quietly shelved or treated as unrelated. Families begged for answers, flyers went up, vigils were held. The police issued generic statements, but nothing happened, and McArthur kept landscaping. By 2017, the disappearances had become impossible to ignore. A new task force was formed, Project Prism, and pressure began mounting on the Toronto police. Then came a break. Andrew Kinsman, a well-known LGBTQ+ activist, went missing. Unlike previous victims, Kinsman had a larger social circle. He was vocal, visible, loved by many. His friends noticed immediately. One key clue, a note in his calendar, Bruce. Investigators looked into his contacts, traced the name to Bruce McArthur, a 66-year-old part-time mall Santa and full-time gardener who had worked for dozens of local residents over the past decade. He had prior contact with police too, a 2001 assault charge involving a male sex worker, which was later dropped. But what really alarmed investigators was what they found during surveillance. McArthur was still meeting men online, still inviting them over, still operating. The police staged a sting. In January 2018, they entered his apartment while a potential new victim was restrained but alive, minutes away from what could have been another disappearance. McArthur was arrested. And then came the unearthing, literal and figurative. Police searched over 30 properties where McArthur had done landscaping work. At one home in Leaside, they began digging through large garden planters stored behind the garage. Inside, buried in the soil, were human remains, dismembered, decomposed, but carefully packed. Not in haste, not in fear, deliberately, forensically. The final count, 8 victims, dismembered and hidden in planters. Most had ligature marks. Several had been photographed post-mortem. Some had hair trimmed post-death, a detail that still haunts detectives. MacArthur kept souvenirs, jewelry, photos, IDs, and like Berdella, he had folders labeled with victims' names. He was, in essence, keeping a garden of ghosts, and for nearly a decade, no one noticed. What horrified the public most wasn't just the deaths, it was how close he had been to them all along. He wasn't a recluse, he was active in his community. He played Santa Claus at a local mall each year, families posed with him, children sat on his lap. His landscaping business had dozens of clients across Toronto's upscale neighborhoods. He was considered trustworthy, and when the public realized he had been using those same garden planters to hide bodies, planters often left behind at customers' homes, the panic spread. Were people unknowingly tending to flower beds filled with human remains? The thought was too much. Police assured the public that all remains had been located, but the psychological damage had already been done. How do you look at your backyard the same way again? MacArthur pled guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder in 2019. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. He showed no emotion in court. His voice when he spoke was soft, apologetic even, but it rang hollow. The families of the victims wept. Many still refuse to forgive the police for failing to connect the early disappearances. Community leaders pointed to systemic bias, that the police acted only when a white, middle-class activist went missing after years of immigrant men vanishing without urgency. An internal review later confirmed multiple missed opportunities. In one instance, MacArthur had been interviewed by police years earlier and released even after his name had surfaced in connection to missing men. He was hiding in plain sight, and it worked, because people believed what he showed them. A smile, a Santa suit, a pair of shears, a gardener with time and patience. Who would suspect that he used those same shears to dismember bodies, or that the flowers he planted grew over the bones of the very men who once trusted him? MacArthur was not a shadow. He was a mirror, reflecting back the blind spots of a society too willing to believe that evil looks a certain way. He reminded us that sometimes horror comes with a clean shirt and good references, and that the most terrifying monsters are the ones who make you feel safe until the door clicks shut. Bruce MacArthur's arrest sent shockwaves across borders, not just because of the horror uncovered in Toronto, but because it revealed a blueprint for how a killer could operate within plain society, surrounded by digital footprints and smiling selfies, without ever raising a red flag until it was nearly too late. Investigators across North America began combing through cold cases, especially those involving LGBTQ+ victims, undocumented migrants, or individuals who fell between the cracks of consistent law enforcement follow-up. It wasn't just Toronto asking how this had happened. It was every city with a community that had begged, pleaded, and protested while their loved ones vanished without answers. But the hard truth was this: MacArthur didn't invent a new kind of evil. He merely perfected the illusion of safety. He put a friendly face on calculated predation. The fact that he used gardening, one of the most nurturing, life-giving professions, to literally bury the dead made his case a twisted metaphor for the trust he violated. And yet, as police wrapped up their findings and victims' families tried to reconstruct meaning from ashes, another chilling thought emerged. How many more like him are still out there, operating not with violence, but with time, patience, and silence? The answer, as it turns out, was already buried deep in another American city, thousands of miles away, where someone had done the unthinkable, not once, not twice, but over the course of 3 decades. His name wouldn't be revealed until years later, but his shadow already haunted the neighborhoods of South Los Angeles. He was quiet, calculated, and then he disappeared for 14 years, like death itself taking a sabbatical. They called him the Grim Sleeper. When the grim sleeper first struck, no one called him that. No one even believed a serial killer was operating. South Los Angeles in the 1980s was already drowning in homicide reports, most linked to gang violence, drugs, or domestic disputes. Victims, often poor, often black, often women, were found in alleyways, dumpsters, or abandoned lots. Many were stripped, shot at close range, and discarded like garbage. The police filed reports. The coroner took photos, but no one connected the dots. It wasn't until community activists started noticing similarities in the bodies, gunshot wounds to the chest, signs of sexual assault, and the consistent targeting of vulnerable women, that anyone began whispering what the LAPD refused to say aloud. Someone was hunting them, and he wasn't doing it in haste. He was doing it with calm repetition. The first confirmed victim was Deborah Jackson in 1985, then Henrietta Wright, then Barbara Ware, then dozens more, women with names, families, lives. But to the press and police, they were often reduced to their circumstances: prostitutes, drug addicts, runaways, people easier to ignore. Between 1985 and 1988, at least 10 women were murdered in similar ways, most in the same neighborhood, many within blocks of each other. But then, suddenly, it stopped. For over a decade, nothing. No bodies, no matching ballistics, no whispers. The killings had simply vanished. The city moved on. Families buried their daughters and waited for justice that never came. Investigators quietly let the files gather dust. And the killer? He just waited. He lived in the same house, drove the same car, worked as a mechanic for the LAPD at one point, married, raised a family, and remained invisible, not because he was hiding, but because no one was really looking. Until 2002, when another woman, a 14-year gap after the last killing, was found dead under almost identical conditions. Then another in 2003, and another in 2007. The bullet patterns matched. So did the victim profile. It was as if time had frozen. Same type of weapon, same style of execution, same disposal patterns. Only the city had changed. There were no security cameras, cell phones, forensic databases, and in 2008, the term "grim sleeper" finally surfaced, a nickname for a killer who had gone dormant for over a decade, only to re-emerge without warning. It took another year for law enforcement to even publicly acknowledge they were dealing with a serial killer. And it wasn't until 2010, 25 years after the first murder, that police finally arrested a suspect. Lonnie David Franklin Jr., a 57-year-old former sanitation worker, part-time mechanic, and full-time neighbor. His home was in the exact same area where many of the murders had occurred. His car, a faded orange Ford Pinto, had been spotted near multiple crime scenes. But what ultimately brought him down was DNA. Not his directly, but his son's. In a bizarre twist of science and desperation, the LAPD used familial DNA tracking to find a partial match in the state's database, not to the killer himself, but to his offspring. That led them to Franklin. A discarded pizza crust sealed the deal. His DNA matched at least 10 of the murder victims. When police raided his home, they found something worse than they had expected. Hidden behind false walls and tucked inside photo albums were hundreds of photographs of women, some naked, some unconscious, some possibly dead. Many were never identified. To this day, over 180 women remain unknown. Their images were taken in various states of distress, their faces frozen in time. He had been cataloging them, collecting them, keeping souvenirs, just like Berdella and MacArthur. But Franklin added one more layer: anonymity. Some of the photos showed women who were never linked to any crime scene, never reported missing, never seen again. How many women did Lonnie Franklin kill? The official count stands at 10, but most believe it's closer to 25. Some put the number over 100, and the gap between confirmed murders, 14 years, might not have been a pause at all. He may have just gotten better at hiding them. The idea of a man killing in cycles, stopping and starting as if murder were a seasonal habit, was already disturbing. But the idea that he could continue to live in the very neighborhood he was preying on, fixing neighbors' cars, laughing at cookouts, raising a son, while women vanished all around him, was almost too much to process. The community was furious, rightfully so, because, from the start, the victims had been ignored, marginalized, judged, and therefore forgotten. Franklin knew that. He didn't kill prominent figures. He killed women he assumed no one would come looking for. And for the most part, he was right. The media barely reported the disappearances. The police never issued citywide alerts. There were no press conferences, no sketches, and no urgency. One woman, Enietra Washington, had survived, shot, raped, left for dead. She later testified that Franklin had offered her a ride, pulled out a gun, and snapped photos of her bleeding face before dumping her in an alley. She remembered his face, but no one listened for years. When she finally pointed him out in court, the weight of her words settled over the room like fog. He had looked her in the eyes, smiled, pulled the trigger, and walked away. Franklin was convicted on 10 counts of murder in 2016. He was sentenced to death, but died in prison in 2020 before the sentence was carried out. He never confessed, never explained the 14-year gap, never acknowledged the photos, and never revealed the names of the women whose faces are still stored in evidence boxes, waiting to be identified. His silence outlived him, but the questions he left behind still fester. How many more? Why those women? And how could so many lives vanish in the middle of a city and be met with nothing but indifference? These are the kinds of killers who don't rely on chaos or panic. They rely on silence. And once again, that silence nearly let him walk free forever. The death of Lonnie Franklin Jr. in prison brought no closure, no final confession, no list of names, no remorse, only silence. For the families of the known victims, it was the end of a trial, but not the end of torment. For the families of the unknown women in those photographs, frozen in time, unclaimed, unidentified, it was a door slammed shut. No answers, no bodies. Just lingering doubt that the justice system ever cared in the first place. Franklin's case exposed not just a killer, but a blind spot so wide it swallowed generations of victims. He relied on that blind spot, exploited it, fed off it. And as his story unraveled in courtrooms and newspaper headlines, the world was forced to reckon with an uncomfortable truth. Monsters don't need to wear masks. Sometimes they wear wedding rings, carry grocery bags, nod politely from the driveway, and sometimes they kill only when they feel like it. But what if there was a killer who didn't even need a motive? Someone who didn't rely on rage or fantasy or opportunity, but simply picked victims because they were there. No connection, no pattern. Just murder for the sake of control. Enter Israel Keys, a man who shattered every behavioral profile the FBI had built over decades. He didn't stalk his neighbors. He didn't kill in bursts or frenzies. He planned like an architect, operated like a ghost. And the scariest part? He didn't care who you were, only that you were alone, unguarded, and unlucky. Born in Utah and raised in an ultra-isolated, off-the-grid religious household, Keys grew up with a strange combination of extremist ideology, wilderness survival skills, and deep resentment for organized society. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already begun fantasizing about murder. But unlike most killers, Keys wasn't sloppy or impulsive. He didn't leave a trail. He didn't even start in his home state. Instead, he built a strategy, a system, And he did something almost no other killer has ever done. He planted kill kits, caches of weapons, restraints, and disposal tools in random locations across the United States, years in advance. That way, he could fly into a city, rent a car, dig up the kit, kill a complete stranger, dispose of them without leaving a trail, and vanish before the body was even reported missing. He had kits buried in Vermont, New York, Washington, Wyoming, and possibly more. Some were recovered after his arrest. Others have never been found. He didn't target a type. He avoided patterns. He read about serial killers and deliberately did the opposite. No common victimology, no geographic consistency, no calling card. He even turned off his phone and paid in cash. In short, he made himself impossible to catch until the day he broke his own rules. In February 2012, 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was working the late shift at a coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska. The CCTV footage is haunting. A man approaches the window, demands money, then jumps inside, abducts her at gunpoint. It was clumsy, reckless, public. Nothing like Keyes' usual MO. But Samantha wasn't a random target. Not entirely. Keyes had stalked her for days. He broke his pattern, took her to a shed behind his house, assaulted her, killed her the next day. Then, in a level of cruelty that shocked even seasoned agents, he left her body frozen in the shed for nearly 2 weeks while he went on a family vacation. When he returned, he applied makeup to the corpse, sewed her eyes open to make it appear she was alive, and staged a photo with a ransom note. He drained her bank account over time, using her ATM card in multiple states, and that's where he slipped. Surveillance cameras finally caught glimpses of the man behind the crimes. When Keyes was pulled over in Texas in March 2012, police didn't yet know who they had in custody, but inside his car were Samantha's debit card, her phone, her ID, and a gun. Once in custody, the stories began to unravel, slowly, methodically, like Keyes himself. He confessed to Samantha's murder, then to others, then more. At least 11 murders by his count. Maybe more. He couldn't or wouldn't give full details. But he admitted to killing a couple in Vermont, Bill and Lorraine Currier, in 2011. He had flown into Chicago, driven over 1,000 miles, dug up a kill kit he'd buried years earlier, and selected the couple at random. He broke into their home, tied them up, took them to an abandoned house, shot Bill, assaulted and strangled Lorraine, then burned the house down. He didn't know them, didn't even speak to them before choosing them. They just happened to be home. That was enough. What terrified the FBI most wasn't just the murders. It was the possibility that there were more kits, more victims, and more names they would never uncover. Keyes was smart, disciplined, detached. He viewed murder the way a pilot views flight, something to be prepared for, executed cleanly, and walked away from. His only weakness was arrogance. In prison, he played games with investigators, doodled skulls in his cell, demanded anonymity in media coverage. Then, in December 2012, he was found dead in his cell. Suicide, throat slashed, wrists cut, blood-soaked note beneath him. No final confession. No victim list, just darkness. Even in death, he refused to give closure. To this day, the FBI continues to investigate cold cases believed to be linked to Keyes. Some kits remain missing, some names remain unidentified, and in dozens of families across the country, a quiet terror remains. That their child, their parent, their friend didn't just vanish. They were erased by a man who treated murder like a business trip. No rage, no passion, just cold logistics and buried boxes. Israel Keyes didn't die like most killers do, screaming innocence, begging for a retrial, blaming their past. He died like he lived, calculated, composed, and on his terms. In the early hours of December 2nd, 2012, Guards found his lifeless body on the floor of his Anchorage jail cell. He had slit his wrists with a disposable razor and jammed paper towels into the wounds to prevent clotting. He'd also used his own blood to draw 11 skulls on the walls and one upside-down pentagram. Some believe the skulls represented his confirmed or intended victims. Others believe it was just theater. But what terrified investigators most wasn't the blood or the ritual. It was the silence. With Keyes dead, the last thread to identifying more victims vanished. No more questions, no more maps, no final count. Just a blank space where names should have been. FBI agents scrambled to make sense of his interviews, timelines, and travel records. They uncovered evidence that he had taken trips without clear purpose, flown into cities with no family or friends, rented cars, and vanished into wilderness roads, all while telling no one. He paid in cash, bought tools in different states, dug holes years before committing the crime. He even researched future victims based on hiking forums and rural community websites. At least 3 other people are suspected to be among his victims. One missing woman's last known location matches Keyes' GPS logs. Another case in Washington state was reopened after they realized a previously anonymous man photographed nearby was Keyes. But confirmation is difficult because he never took trophies, never contacted media, never craved recognition. He killed and disappeared. That was enough. And because of that, his crimes remain one of the FBI's biggest cold case nightmares. They created a dedicated website and hotline just for tips about him. It's still active. Every few months, a new possible lead emerges. A missing person from a park in Montana, a lone hiker in Utah, a couple traveling through remote Idaho. The scope of Keyes' method was so wide and deliberately patternless that any one of them could fit. And that's what makes him unique in the history of American serial killers. He didn't seek notoriety. He sought mastery, not of the body, but of the system. He studied every mistake other killers made and vowed never to repeat them. No contacting police, no trophies, no repeating locations, no media taunts. He even made it a point to never kill close to home until the night he took Samantha Koenig. That one crack in his perfect record led to his downfall. But even his mistakes were more organized than most killers' routines. The shed where he kept her body was temperature controlled. He bankrolled himself through small burglaries. He once robbed a Texas bank just to fund a trip where he planned to kill, and no one connected the crimes. He also had no ideological motive, no vengeance, no manifesto. In one interview, he said plainly, "I just like doing it." He described murder as a compulsion, not an addiction. He said it wasn't about anger or sex. It was about power, control, and the satisfaction of vanishing without consequence. One of the most chilling moments during the FBI interviews came when they asked why he finally killed in Alaska, breaking all his own rules. He paused and said, "I was getting tired of waiting." That statement sent a shiver through seasoned agents, because it implied there had been more plans, more kits, more murders, already mapped out, just waiting to be activated. The agents realized something else too. If Samantha hadn't fought back, if her ATM card hadn't triggered surveillance alerts, if one of the withdrawals hadn't caught the attention of a sharp-eyed Texas Highway Patrol officer, Israel Keyes would still be out there, flying across the country, digging up his next kit, choosing his next victim, and walking away as if nothing had happened. To date, his full list of victims remains unknown. Some believe the real number is closer to 20. Others believe we'll never know because some bodies may never be found. Some weren't even reported missing. That's the darkest part of Keyes' legacy. He reminded the world that not all killers have a signature. Some erase their footprints as they walk, and sometimes they don't stop because they're caught. They stop because they decide to. With his death, the manhunt ended. But the paranoia began. FBI analysts were forced to revisit what they thought they knew about serial crime. That killers escalate, that they can't stop, that they need recognition. Israel Keyes debunked it all, and in doing so, he exposed the fragility of our safety. The idea that if we lock our doors, avoid certain areas, stay vigilant, we'll be protected. But Keyes didn't care where you lived. He just needed you to be alone, preferably near a quiet trailhead, a rural inn, or a dark driveway after midnight. His victims weren't chosen out of passion or revenge. They were chosen out of convenience. And that, more than anything, made him a nightmare that didn't fit in any box. He was method over madness, process over rage. And while the rest of the world slept, he was quietly preparing, digging, studying, waiting. Even now, somewhere out there, buried beneath layers of soil and leaves, are kits he left behind. Some might never be found. Others may outlast the homes built above them. And if that doesn't keep you up at night, nothing will. What ties these men together isn't just blood, it's the silence that followed them. They didn't operate in shrieking chaos or blazing headlines. They didn't leave trails of screaming witnesses or explosive crime scenes. They killed in the quiet, in the gap between suspicion and certainty. And in that silence, they thrived. Bob Berdella tortured men behind locked doors for years, in a house neighbors never thought to question. Bruce MacArthur buried victims beneath the very gardens he was paid to make beautiful. Lonnie Franklin Jr. stopped for 14 years, and no one even noticed. And Israel Keyes, perhaps the most terrifying of them all, killed like a professional. Not for pleasure, not for passion, but for precision. We tell ourselves monsters are loud, that they rage, scream, stumble, that they're broken glass and unmade beds and trail mix-ups. But the truth, the dangerous, persistent truth, is that most monsters learn early on that the world rewards invisibility. If you smile the right way, dress clean, pay your taxes, and keep your yard trimmed, you become untouchable. The world doesn't just fail to see you, it refuses to. It was never just about the murders. It was about how easy it was to keep going. Berdella was arrested not because of noise, but because one victim got away. MacArthur's smiling photographs might have fooled the public forever if body parts hadn't started showing up in planters. Franklin was only found through a genetic breadcrumb, and Keyes, despite his terrifying range, made just one mistake, using an ATM too many times. These men were not careless. They were careful. But even more than that, they were surrounded by institutions that weren't watching. Police departments ignored patterns. Media outlets downplayed victims based on class or color. Communities leaned into the belief that it could never happen here. The killers didn't hide behind masks. They hid behind our own indifference. Because most people don't look twice at a gardener or a middle-aged neighbor or a well-spoken handyman. Most people don't ask why someone walks alone at night or why they take their garbage out at 3 a.m. Most people never check what lies beneath the flower bed or what kind of tape sits in the basement drawer. And that's what makes this worse. These stories don't happen in caves or bunkers or deep forests. They happen in plain sight, inside city houses, in church communities, near schools. They happen in grocery store parking lots, in the coffee stands we pass on the way home, in the rental car parked beside us at the motel. These killers used familiarity as camouflage. Not one of them wore the cliché. No wild eyes, no twitchy hands, no heavy breathing in alleyways. In fact, many were liked. Some were respected. MacArthur was invited to weddings. Franklin repaired LAPD squad cars. Keyes ran a construction business with 5-star reviews. Berdella was a neighborhood activist, and that's the pattern. Not what they did, but what we failed to see. Because if we accept that monsters look like this, smile like this, blend like this, we lose the illusion of safety. We lose the lie we tell ourselves, that evil is obvious, that it announces itself with a roar. But evil, in these 5 stories, knocked politely. It brought tools in a bag. It drove slowly. It wore khakis. It asked how your weekend was. Then it picked someone no one would miss, someone whose lifestyle could be used to discredit them, and made them disappear. And the world, too distracted or disbelieving, let it happen. That's what makes these killers more than criminals. It makes them symptoms. Of what? Of everything we pretend not to see. The cracks in the system, the gaps in the search, the belief that certain people don't deserve headlines, that addicts, sex workers, runaways, undocumented migrants, queer teens are just cautionary tales, not lives. And the killers knew it. That's why they chose them. Not because they hated them, but because no one would fight for them. And they were right. For far too long. It wasn't just the brutality of the acts. It was the machinery that allowed it to keep spinning, unquestioned. Every death was a gamble that society would stay asleep. And most of the time, it did.